The 2008 global food crisis and subsequent food price spikes are potent reminders of the enduring unpredictability and instability of the global agri-food system. Now, few analysts foresaw the crisis, and fewer could have imagined the extent and duration of its consequences. High and volatile prices have disrupted global food flows and made concerns about access and supply of food preeminent in national and international policy. So really, since the 2008 global food crisis, food security has taken on a meaning and a place in global politics which we have not seen really in about 25, 30 years, and it's really stayed with us as opposed to sort of disappearing. Now, we're seeing also widening asymmetries of producer power, which are evident in the inability of small-scale farmers to produce or to benefit from higher prices. Meanwhile, we see that transnational agri-food corporations are also enjoying record profits. Whereas the recent data suggests that the crisis was perhaps less severe than was initially estimated, heightened levels of human deprivation and indignity remain a global concern given how unevenly the crisis effects were distributed, particularly across the African continent where the number of undernourished people has increased in absolute terms since 2008 by 20%. Now, unlike the world food crisis of 1974, when food prices rose but quickly returned to pre-crisis level after a couple of years, food prices remain above pre-crisis levels and thus point to a historical disjuncture from the longer-term decline of food prices. So I've got a figure, not the best one, but where is it? That gives you a sense of this. So these are the trends. So this is the FAO's food price index showing us real food prices from 1961 to 2010. And the trend is, it's pretty clear. I mean, it's starting to go up and we're sort of tailing off here, but it's a real disjuncture from the era of cheap food, which was really this period from the post-war till about 2008. And the durability of the present crisis, which is now running 5 years, it's quite important from a development perspective in the sense that it has erased much of the gains that were made in about the last 20, 30 years in terms of reducing food insecurity. And so in terms of in a few years, the crisis has really wiped out gains that took decades to achieve. Now, the end of cheap food is regularly discussed in terms of the crisis' highly unequal effects on the capacity of individuals and households to access food. But an important overlooked dimension of the end of cheap food is its influence in the structuring of interstate relations, and in particular geopolitics. Recall that declining food prices were the distinguishing characteristic of the post-war global food order. And cheap food was the outcome of a particular geopolitics and geoeconomy of food, one where mounting agricultural structural surpluses in the north were accommodated by a mix of southern food import dependency and international food aid abroad. And this geoeconomics of food resulted from and also reproduced a very specific set of geopolitical relations that permitted, for example, the use of food as an instrument of U.S. foreign economic policy ambitions and also facilitating the reconstruction of post-war Europe and selective parts of Asia. Later transformations of the geopolitical food order, including the restructuring of agriculture in the developing world towards non-food commodity exports in the 1970s and 1980s, and also followed by the increasing corporate control of the global agri-food system in the 1990s forwards, need to be understood as historical outcomes that are consistent with the political economy conditions embedded in the era of cheap food. And an event like the global food crisis brings into sharp relief that much world hunger is not really the inevitable outcome of natural phenomena, but it is really a form of geopolitical violence that is socially constructed through specific interstate power relations. Now, such power relations in geopolitical food orders require a particular set of institutional architectures that both legitimize them and facilitate them. And trade rules under the embedded liberalism of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the GATT, and its neoliberal successor, the World Trade Organization, are such particular architectures. Now, the global food crisis is occurring during a historical moment of intense geopolitical conflicts over the future of the global agri-food system at the WTO in particular. And it is not insignificant that since the crisis, many states have taken a multitude of actions that diverge from the WTO's project of free trade in food. And in particular, these actions include the increasing use of food export restrictions, national food self-sufficiency policies, efforts to regulate agricultural derivatives, and the acquisition of farmland abroad. These actions all suggest that states are seriously reconsidering and at least pursuing alternatives to international trade in food to achieve national food security, what Philip Michael is calling security mercantilism, and as was mentioned also by Anna in her paper yesterday. Now, the question of how the global food crisis may be altering the geopolitics of food security and the international trade system has actually received very little attention, particularly by scholars of international trade. And this is actually, I would argue, a significant omission given the WTO's role as the principal interstate forum for international and domestic food policy and in structuring global food relations, productions, and flows. So this article argues for the value of a critical geopolitics, which includes an analysis of interstate contests over food security at the WTO. So before I jump into sort of the approach that I take in this paper, I use this term agro-power throughout my presentation. It's a term I guess I came up with by accident. It's not really a very specific concept, but it's really a heuristic that I use in this paper to talk about the different ways that states and non-state actors can control or seek to control the global agro-food system, and that includes both sort of material productive power, but also ideological power. So it rings with a lot of discussions we've been having here. But you might be thinking, well, why are we talking about the WTO? Why does the WTO matter for food security? And at least the way I come at it is that and I've argued elsewhere that the Agreement of Agriculture in particular, it sets the parameters for both international and national food security policy. So if you want to implement food stamps, you want to implement any type of agricultural program that is addressing food security, it has to be consistent with all the rules of the WTO Agreement on Agriculture, which are very specific and detailed in addressing even domestic food insecurity. So we often there's this particular mythology about the Agreement on Agriculture, which I'm going to challenge a bit today, but I think it's really important to keep in mind that it does set the parameters for all food security policy at the national and international level. So, I mean, this article is really primarily interested in analyzing the interstate power relations, and thus takes states as the central unit of analysis. And to some extent, I'm also considering international organizations as actors in my paper, because they're both arenas for interstate politics, but they are actors with their own interests as well. Private actors in global civil society are not part of this study, and I'm going to argue that's for two reasons. First, while private actors in global society are important for the study of global food politics more generally and the global food system, they're not really crucial or playing a role in the geopolitics of food security at the WTO. And this paper in particular cautions against uncritically reading in private power into the geopolitics of food security at the WTO. Now, we know that transnational agribusiness does lobby individual states, and they do follow WTO negotiations, but a real careful analysis of literature on the WTO makes it quite clear that the WTO is not dominated by agribusiness interests, nor can outcomes of the negotiations at the WTO be directly linked to specific agribusiness interests. Now, this is actually in sharp contrast to TRIPS, so the rules on intellectual trade property, and also the rules on services, which we know were written by transnational corporations, advanced at the WTO, and essentially they got the outcome they want. But this is not the case when it comes to agriculture and food. Okay, so I'm running out of time quicker than I thought. Thanks. And the other reason I don't look at global civil society is that they're not engaged at the WTO in a meaningful way. They don't have an influence, and much of the global food sovereignty movement explicitly is set up in opposition to the WTO and does not really participate in the politics of the WTO. On the same hand, the paper is really quite careful about not reifying the state and following all the warnings by John Agnew and others of not seeing the state as a black box, and I don't do that, but I think when you study the WTO and you study agriculture at the WTO, you need to take in mind its very idiosyncratic operational and negotiation structure, which actually tends to reinforce and amplify traditional interstate power relations and modes of engagement. So the paper makes sort of three sort of theoretical, analytical arguments, and the first is that the study of WTO, it really calls for a critical geopolitics approach that renders more visible the spatial reconfiguration of production and power in the global agri-food system and their representation in global food politics. Now, historically, the study of global food politics has taken the U.S. political hegemony and market dominance of northern agribusiness as a central feature of a globalizing agri-food system. However, the global food crisis is occurring during a moment of transition away from a U.S.-dominated international food regime towards a polycentric one. And global food production today is no longer dominated by the northern grain-producing nations of the U.S., Europe, European Union, Canada, and Australia, but in particular, southern agro-food powerhouses such as Brazil, Thailand, Vietnam, and Argentina, for example, make up an increasing and major share of world agricultural production, trade, and consumption. Moreover, many of these countries compete directly and quite successfully with the U.S. and other northern states in third country markets for temperate products such as wheat and soybeans. And in the case of rice, we've seen Thailand and Vietnam displace the U.S. Another important note is that many of these emerging agro-powers are in fact major producers of what have been called flex crops, which are crops that have multiple food and fuel uses, such as palm oil, soybeans, sugarcane, and maize, which are really critical to the emerging global biofuel complex and the political economy of the green economy. The spatial reconfiguration of food production and trade flows is accompanied by a corresponding geopolitical shift in agro-power observable along multiple fronts of global food and agricultural governance. For example, the Doha round of WTO agricultural negotiations has seen a group of emerging countries led by Brazil, China, and India successfully block U.S. ambitions. And another example is the creation of a group of 20 agricultural ministers, which now is sort of the main global policy space for discussing agriculture and food issues. Parallel to these political developments, the expansion of transnational agro-food corporations from emerging states also confirms that private agro-power is also becoming far more polycentric. We had the example of Brazilian-based JBS Foods, which ranks at the top of global market share for meat and grains, and is consolidating their position through direct acquisition of agri-food interests in the U.S. and Europe. Abu Dhabi recently created its own global food trading firm to compete with Cargill and Archer Daniel Midlands. And more recently, the Chinese firm Shuanghui has purchased U.S.-based Smithfield Foods, the world's largest pork producer. So not only is the transnational reach of southern-based agri-food rapidly expanding, it also actually blurs a public-private divide because in emerging agro-powers, states and firms work closely together including direct state support for national agri-foods to expand abroad. So the transition towards a polycentric global agri-food system is underway where traditional northern states and agri-food firms no longer dominate as they previously did. And in turn, this transition opens up new geopolitical spaces and opportunities to reconstitute agro-power relations, including vis-a-vis alterations to existing international architectures. Second, critical geopolitics of agro-power problematizes existing geospatial categories, such as North and South, through which struggles over the global agri-food system are generally articulated. Now, scholarship on the global politics of food has a tendency to view North-South struggles over agro-power as the most significant political fault line, and this is really evident in the scholarship on global agricultural restructuring, for example, on northern mandated structural adjustment programs in the South and later trade liberalization in the 1990s. Now, whereas a North-South conflict frame has been powerful one to explain the past, it follows that a shift towards a polycentric global agri-food system would require a shift to a conflict-based approach that needs to be much more multivalent. And the point here is not that North-South categorizations are no longer relevant, but it is their uncritical use needs to be challenged. And I think the example of land grabs provides a really good case of that. And sort of the final point, or the theoretical contribution that the paper makes is and just sorry to get there since I'm out of time, third is a critical geopolitics of agropower needs to alert us to the interstate contest over geopolitical agents to exert greater control in the governance of global agri-food system. So U.S. hegemony is evident in the IMF and the World Bank, where it enjoys the majority voting rights and final say on policy. But however, there's been growing scholarly attention to the limits of U.S. hegemony in international institutions, and the examples of the International Criminal Court or the Landmine Treaty are examples. So following these insights, what this article does, it tries to conceptualize formal international organizations as geopolitical agents over which control is constantly contested because of their importance for the maintenance or remaking of specific geopolitical food orders. Now, the redistribution of agropower in an ever more polycentric global agri-food system suggests the needs to take contest over geopolitical agents much more seriously, and in this case, the WTO. And in the context of a polycentric global agri-food system, we should expect to see new and different interstate conflicts in seeking to steer the WTO towards positions that confirm and enhance the agropower of certain states. And what I argue in the paper is that we see a much stronger division of food politics occurring amongst net food exporters versus net food importers, which do not fall easily on a north-south axis. So the paper is much more empirical, but these are sort of the broader theoretical points that the paper tries to contribute. So thank you.